bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the May 12th, 2026 episode. As our audience on YouTube can see, my guest this week is Thomas Stagg. Thomas is a partner in Novogradac's Metro Seattle office. I'm really excited to have Thomas back on the podcast. Thomas is a very popular guest, and today's topic always ranks very high in views and downloads. Thomas is Novogradac's leading expert on rent and income limits for affordable housing properties, and as many of you know, chairs Novogradac's Income Limits Working Group. Now, I don't believe, and I think many in our audience agree with me, there aren't many people outside of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, who know as much about rent and income limits as Thomas. Today's topic, if you haven't guessed it already, is about the recent release, May 1st, to be exact, of this year's HUD income limits. That was a mere 11 days ago when we were recording this podcast on Monday, May 11th for posting on Tuesday. Now, as most of our audience know, HUD income limits are the basis for two critical things. One is determining the eligibility of families seeking to rent long-term pastoral properties, as well as other HUD-assisted housing. That's one is the income qualifications. The other, the income limits are used to calculate rent limits for properties financed by low-budget tax credit equity. Now, HUD releases income limits only. They don't release rent limits, but the rent limits are calculated in accordance with Section 42. Novogradac does have a free rented income limit calculator that does the work of extrapolating rent limits based on the published income information. Novogradac also has a rent and income limit estimator. That's a tool very popular among developers, investors, syndicators, lenders, and others. We also have other services around QCTs, DDAs, and the rest, which we'll talk about in the course of the podcast with Thomas. Also, I want to let you know that Thomas has written a blog post on the income limits, and I will share a link to that in today's show notes to today's podcast. Also, we have a webinar on this topic on income limits, and it's scheduled for next Friday, May 22nd. And when I say next, I don't mean this Friday. I mean a week after this Friday. I know there's some confusion sometimes when you say next, which Friday that is. I will share a link to that webinar as well. There's a lot to talk about today, so if you're ready, let's get started. Thomas, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday. This
Thanks,
is your
Mike.
17th time as a guest on the podcast. And in case you're counting, that ties you with Dirk Wallace for fourth place among guests, behind only Tony Raponi, Peter Lawrence, and Brad Elphick. Let me say welcome back.
Thanks. It doesn't feel like it's been more than 10.
Well, you just have so much fun.
Yes.
It doesn't seem like so many. So you've been on the podcast, as I noted, plenty of times before, but as I like to give my guests every week, please take an opportunity to share some of the services that you provide to Novogradac clients.
Yeah, I work mainly with developers. So of course I work on income and rent limits, and I assist in updating our calculator and preparing the income limit estimates. But in my day job, for the rest of the year, when it's not income limit time, I mainly work with developers who are building affordable housing, and I assist with application services, pre-development services, and then of course the annual audit and tax returns. And so it keeps me pretty busy throughout the year.
And I would just say you came to rent and income limits from your serving developers and realizing how important the rent and income limit calculations were, which led to the estimators of the other services we'll talk about. So I'll just say to our audience, if there are other kind of unique aspects of developing LIHTC properties where you want to get a little bit more analysis, I'm sure Thomas is one that could provide that analysis. And if he can't, or someone I know that can, or shortly we'll be able to. So Thomas, let's start at a very high level. If you could just share some very basic takeaways, overviews, however you'd like to frame it, of this year's income limits. I want to dive down in a variety of areas, but if you could just start with a general overview, I know our audience would appreciate that.
Yeah, I think big picture is that it is good news. the average increase is 3.44%. And so that is a nice steady increase in both incomes for tenants who are trying to qualify, but also rents for properties that are trying to cover their operating expenses, maintain their properties at a high level. And so it's a nice steady increase. It's probably higher than your underwriting when you underwrote the projects, but it is lower than we've seen for the last couple of years. Last year was a 6.2% increase. And so it's quite a big down from prior years, but still a nice steady increase. And I think the one takeaway, Mike, I'm sure we'll dive more into this in a couple minutes, but as I've been telling people, it's a year of either big increases or some decreases. And so we see that this year, 17% of the areas had a decrease, which is up a lot from last year. Only less than 5% of areas had a decrease last year. This year, it's around 17, 18% of areas that have a decrease. So it's something new we need to think about. How's that impacting our properties? But at the same time, we had a large percentage of areas that had increases. Over 18% had an increase of greater than 8%. So we see that we have properties on both sides of the spectrum here. So obviously, as we talk, we're going to understand more about individual areas and individual properties. But those are my big two takeaways, that on average, things are looking pretty good, but then we have some very big extremes that we're looking at as well.
I want to come back to a question of what leads to a decrease and some of the calculations that are involved there, where some of the underlying information can be rising, but it leads to a decrease. But I don't want to do that just yet. So the limits were announced May 1st, which means they have to be implemented by June 14th, 45 days after the announcement. And many clients will be wanting to implement them, obviously a lot earlier than that. Any comments on the implementation?
Yeah, so I think that it's important to note that if they're going up, I always say implement right away for qualifying residents, right? We want residents to be able to qualify. You've already started on the paperwork, and if this increase can help a resident qualify, that's great. But for rents, obviously, we're being a little more mindful when we implement those. A lot of jurisdictions have implemented additional rent control, so we have to be concerned about how that's impacting us. Some areas we can only increase rents one time a year, so we need to make sure that we haven't already increased rents, that it's allowed in our lease agreement. And we just want to be mindful of the impact to residents. But for increasing limits, we want to increase those right away. Now, if you're in an area of decrease, for an existing property, that's the same as an area of no change. And so if you're already in service, you don't need to decrease your income or rent limits. So you don't need to decrease your income limits for qualifying residents, and you do not need to decrease your rents for either existing or new residents. It's really just remain status quo. Now, we'll talk more, I think, about new projects later on, about the impact of those. But for the most part, you want to implement income limits right away and start understanding that impact to your property. And then we flow out rent increases as appropriate.
Great. Thank you for that. And I will note that as we go through the podcast, we obviously won't be going into as much depth as you'll be going into in the webinar. Right. So I would encourage our audience on some of these matters, if we're going over them a little bit quickly or using a little bit too much jargon, please do sign up for the webinar. So before we go into more on the insights and highlights and next steps and the like, and to be able to share with the audience more of the background so I can ask you the question about decreases in incomes, please briefly explain the factors that go into determining income limits. And I know we could do a full webinar just on that, much less.
I think we have.
And we have. Yeah. And we'll go into a lot more detail in the webinar on the various factors, which are useful to know as you're developing, so you'll know what the future could hold based upon the different factors, which obviously helps in terms of underwriting, asset management, and the rest. But with all that said, I'll hand Mike over to you.
Yeah. So realistically, there's two big factors we're focused on first. And the first one is the American Community Survey. This is a survey that goes out to a selected population, and it's a survey. So it's a selected population. It's not a random population. And they respond to the survey. And from that, the Census Bureau develops what's called median family income from the American Community Survey, which we'll refer to often as the ACS, American Community Survey. So that's that starting point. We have this American Community Survey data. But due to the timing of how long it takes to collect that data and process it, the data that HUD's using is always 2 years old. So for 2026, we're using 2024 American Community Survey data. So HUD doesn't want to publish the 2024 income limits. They want to publish the 2026 income limits. And so they have to use something to trend that forward. And what they've used last year and this year, they changed last year to use the per capita wages and salary data from the Congressional Budget Office. And that's what they use to trend forward that information for 2 years. And from there, that's how we determine median family income. But for tax credit programs, we use what's called very low income. And there's a handful of adjustments that go into calculating very low income. I'd say that for our purposes today, I'm going to really focus on just one of those adjustments, which is fair market rents, because there's some interesting outcomes of fair market rents this year. And so HUD has this calculation called the high housing cost adjustment, where they calculate a derived income limit based on fair market rents to say, this is how much you need to earn to be able to afford to pay fair market rent in this jurisdiction. If you can't afford that, they increase the income limit up to that level so that more people can qualify for assistance. So that's what we're doing with the high housing cost adjustment. We saw some big adjustments because of that this year. So those are the three kind of big factors that are influencing this year.
Great. Thank you for that, Thomas. And in the webinar, Thomas will go into more detail and some of the other factors that may not be on average as significant, but if it affects your project, they're very significant. So now with that as the background, if you could explain what is driving that 70% of areas where there is a net decrease, what is causing that decrease?
Yeah, so there's a couple of factors that are causing that. One is just your area's income went down. The American Community Survey data reported a lower figure for your area. And so obviously that's going to make your income limits decrease. Second, that trend factor that we talked about, that trend factor is slower this year than it was in prior years. So when we have a slower trend factor, even if your underlying ACS data stayed flat, because our trend factor is lower, you'd actually show a slight decrease, even if your American Community Survey data stayed flat, because the trend is slower. And so those two things, the slower trend factor and also just an overall slowdown in ACS data, is what contributed a lot to our decreases this year. Now, I didn't mention this, and Mike, I apologize. I didn't mention this as one of our adjustments, but there is also a state non-metro adjustment where any area in a state cannot be less than the state non-metro. It's like a floor in your state. And we saw a couple states where the state non-metro actually decreased. And when that happens, all the areas that are subject to that also have a decrease. So we have a state like Colorado. It had a large decrease in its state non-metropolitan median income. And so if you look across Colorado, on average, Colorado is down less than 0.5%, but still down. And that's being driven largely because the state non-metro in that state has decreased.
And when I think of the general calculation, tell me if I have this right, if under ACS, the income didn't change, it's just stayed the same year over year, then almost by definition, you would have a decrease in the calculated factor because a year ago that was increased a year by the inflation factor. So I always think of it as to the extent that income is growing faster than the inflation factor versus at the inflation factor versus below the inflation factor tells you which direction it's going to go, subject to these other factors like the non-metro limit going down.
Yeah, and it's a great point because that inflation factor is a national factor. So every area is getting trended at the same amount. And so if you're an area that's doing better than the inflation factor, you're going to see bigger jumps in the following year because your underlying data is growing faster than you're inflated. But vice versa, right? If you're an area that's growing slower or flat, you got the same inflation factor. And so when you underperformed on that, then the next year you're going to see a decrease.
Right. And the reason why all this is relevant, and I know the reason why you spend so much time on this is because from a development perspective, knowing what's happening over the last few years is what allows you to do the estimator and lets a developer know if they have properties under development, what those rents are likely to be, or within, obviously, there's a variety of factors, lots of disclaimers, but you have a better sense of what it's likely to be over the next few years, as opposed to just saying, assume it goes up 3%.
Yeah. Or assume it just grows at the same rate, right?
Exactly.
And so understanding these inputs helps us create that estimator and have it be, very robust compared to any other kind of methodology because we're basing it on these same factors that HUD's going to use.
Which is something where you would think every underwriter, that's why the estimator is so popular, because if you're an underwriter and you're trying to underwrite a property, you want to know what is the rent growth likely to be to the extent you can know it. So let's get back to the highlights. You gave a brief sort of overview. Share some of the other highlights, things that stood out to you in this year's income limits that you think would be relevant for the audience.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of note some, like you said, highlights. We have some states with notable increases as we look across averaging all the counties in those states. Alaska, Delaware, Florida, Maine, Nevada, and South Carolina all had an average increase of over 6%. So almost doubling that national average. Florida was the highest at 7.54%, which was somewhat surprising to me. I mean, obviously our estimator told me that, but I hadn't dug into Florida that closely to realize that they were going to have the largest increase. And then we had a couple states that were either decreases or very minimal increases. I already mentioned Colorado that had a 0.32% decrease. Indiana had a 0.06 increase, so right there almost flat. And then Rhode Island was also down 1.4%. So we had some notable areas with decreases as well, picking out these large areas that had big decreases. Pensacola, a 5% decrease, Akron, Ohio, 3%. Milwaukee, 2%. So some very large cities, including Cincinnati, New Orleans, Minneapolis, and Oklahoma, rounding out that around 1% decrease. So some kind of very notable cities are having some decreases that I think if you're developing those areas, definitely want to pay attention to what we're going to talk about in the webinar or be aware of what decreases mean to your projects. Then one thing that we did different this year is we tried to look at, it's great to understand what's happening across all the areas. Even weighting it by population is interesting. But this year we overlaid, so HUD has a LIHTC database where they collect all the information from the low-income housing tax credit properties across the country. And now those of you who have played around with this data, there's some data holes in here. But when we try and put all this data together, we sorted and there's 55 counties in the US that have over 10,000 units in that county. And so that seems like a very meaningful sampling of where the projects are. And when we look at that, that average increase is actually better than what we see average across the country. It's a 3.92% increase. But even more interesting, if we take the 10 counties with the most units, the average change is 5%. And that includes areas like Los Angeles and Miami that were subject to this cap, with this 10% cap on your increases. That would have been even higher. So as developers, you would look at this and you'd say, it seems as though we're building units mainly in areas that are increasing at a faster rate than the national average. I don't know what to mean with all that. Maybe that just means that we're building in cities that are growing, or maybe cities are outperforming non-metro areas. But I think it tells an interesting story that when we look at those 10 counties with the most units, we see a very high increase still in our income and rent limits.
And I don't want to surprise you with this question by asking about a specific area, but Los Angeles is a big city. There's a lot of our clients have properties in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles, if there's something you could say about Los Angeles, what has been happening there and what is happened with this release, I'm sure our audience would be interested. And sorry, I didn't prime you for this before we got on the podcast.
This is great. I feel like this is when I get a part of my podcast voice and tell the story here. So Los Angeles is a very interesting area because it's a high housing cost area, which, as we talked about earlier, it's an area that's adjusted by fair market rents. And actually Los Angeles, one of the areas in the country that has the largest adjustment, this high housing cost adjustment increases the income limit by about 30% or higher. I haven't looked at what the exact percentage is this year, but normally it's about a third higher than it is. So I went conservative and said 30% this year. So it causes this big increase. But what happened is when HUD published fair market rents back in last September 2025, Los Angeles had a very modest increase in fair market rents. And so therefore we are estimating, based on all the data that was available, that Los Angeles would be basically flat in income limits. I think they were going up by $50 at the 4%, 50% level. So it's going to be very flat. But if you I think disagree is too strong of a word, but if you think the fair market rents published by HUD are incorrect or not accurately reflecting your market, you can ask for a reevaluation. And it's funny because you ask for the reevaluation, but then you have to go and do all the work yourself. It's like speaking up in a work meeting. And so you say, HUD, I think your calculation's wrong. And basically then you have to go and prove it. So Los Angeles said, HUD, I think your calculation is wrong. And they went out and did their own study. And this is very common for large areas to do these reevaluations. So they did this reevaluation. And on April 21st, about 10 days before the limits came out, the reevaluation was complete and accepted and published by HUD. And now suddenly, as opposed to the fair market rents being flat, suddenly the fair market rents are going up by, I think it was around 11%. It was more than 10%, more than our cap. So Los Angeles went from everybody thinking, oh, we're going to be largely flat this year, to suddenly we're having a 10% increase. And it was all because of this reevaluation. Now, there was 7 other areas that had reevaluations this year. I don't think any were quite as drastic as Los Angeles or as impactful on the scale. But that's why it's important to know all these factors. And if you're either in an area or you work for a PHA and you think that HUD reevaluation or HUD calculation is incorrect, you have that opportunity to do the reevaluation. First, look at the data. Usually you have a lot of data already that might tell you that the HUD calculation is inaccurate for your area. And then you can work to get this reevaluation done.
So you mentioned that the average growth or the mean growth in income is fairly strong, not as strong as it has been in the past. What do you think this means for the future in terms of year-over-year income growth?
Yeah, so it's a little early to know a whole lot because we don't have the American Community Survey data that's kind of that driving point, but we do have some other little tidbits we're picking up, right? First off, if we look at just median family income without these adjustments that HUD had, that increase was right around 2%. So these adjustments that HUD did increased it by about 1.5 percentage by the time we got finally to VLI. And a large part of what kind of held us up here was, number one, the fair market rent adjustments. But number two, last year, if you come back with me, remember about 26%, 27% of areas were capped. And so this year they had lower increase. And so we were able to use some of that cap to create a larger increase this year. Well, this year, only about 8% of areas are capped. So I hate to use the term piggy bank, but I think it's what resonates best with people. We don't have a big piggy bank going into next year. You know, 1/4 of the areas had a piggy bank last year. This year, only 8% of the areas have a piggy bank. So I think that's going to be a little bit slower increase. When I hear what's happening with rents across the country, it definitely feels like they're not increasing as fast as they used to be. And so I think our fair market rent, high housing cost adjustment is going to be a little flatter. And then the final piece is we don't have American Community Survey data yet, but we do have the Congressional Budget Office wages and salary estimate. And we see that the growth that they're estimating in wages and salary is slowing down over the years. All that points to me next year, it's not going to be a gangbusters year like we saw a few years ago where we had an increase of 10% on average. I think we're going to be more that steady 2%. And I don't know, what's going to be interesting as we get closer is it going to be 3% or 1%, right? But I think that's my high and low I'm thinking right now. And again, this is very early. Income limits just came out 10 days ago. I'm still processing what happened. But I think that I'm putting my very conservative hat on right now and thinking about when I'm underwriting, I'm really stress testing things because I've not seen anything that's telling me that we're going to have a big increase in income limits on average, right? Different areas are still going to outperform the average. I think on average, it's going to be a more kind of steady, modest increase for the next couple of years.
Just sort of observe, you mentioned how not as many areas that have piggy banked, if you will, income growth because of the cap. Also, when you look at the 70% of areas that were flat, which meant they actually had a decrease, they have something they have to climb out of as well, which creates downward pressure on the average.
Yeah. Now, longtime income limit users will know this used to be the norm back in 2013, really 2013 through 2017, even maybe back to 2010. It was very modest increases. Some areas even had a decrease on average across a year. And so we're getting back to more of the stable growth that we were used to It's just we've been in a different environment for the last 5-6 years.
No, definitely the inflation that ended up being experienced
Yeah, right.
was working its way through the income limits, not quite as fast as it was working its way through the operating expenses.
Well, yeah.
So let's turn now to the various stakeholders and what the income limit releases mean for various stakeholders. I thought it would make sense for you to first talk about developers/owners, and this is owners of existing properties or properties under development or properties are looking at re-syndicating. If those are the three kind of broad areas, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so definitely existing properties, understand your growth, implement it right away for new residents. But I think when you're looking at capital budgets for the year and looking out further, that you're going to be probably a little more conservative on your growth over the next couple of years and really thinking about timing of when you're doing certain capital projects and things like that. I think for resyndication, kind of a similar discussion. The only thing that kind of layers on with resyndication that we haven't really talked about is areas might be subject to hold harmless or HERA special, which means that your resyndication's enjoying a higher limit than you'd have upon resyndication. So just understanding that, but once you understand if there's there, then it's really very similar as an operating property, partially because you have a stable tenant base that you understand. What I think is interesting right now is really this new construction, either projects that are already in the pipeline or projects that are coming up. It's definitely time to revisit your assumptions. Make sure that your underwriting assumptions are not growing income as we saw over the last 5 years at 5% on average. If you are, maybe that is right for your area and we need to understand that. But I think you really want to start kind of stress testing your assumptions. And even on the flip side, I know this isn't the point of this podcast, but I think operating costs are having a moment again after we stabilized for a while. I think we're back in an inflationary period and thinking about those two factors together. And I know I'm going a little bit off topic here, but I think it's also a good time as I'm thinking about this is thinking about the impact that utility allowances are playing on my rents and thinking about alternative utility allowances and what can I be doing to manage that. I always think of that as a cost. I know people think it's an allowance that reduces our rent, but to me, that's a cost because that's less rent that you're charging. I think people haven't paid attention to that cost closely enough. So for my existing developers, that's why I'm thinking about what should you be thinking about and what should you be doing.
Now, thank you for mentioning the utility allowances because you can sit there and say my gross rent floor means my nominal rent that I'm allowed to charge, my nominal gross rent doesn't change, or if my utility allowance is going up, my
Right.
net rent, my collected rent is going to go down. So it's not as
Yeah.
if hold harmless truly hold you harmless because utility allowances often rising. And I know that on the income limits working group that you chair and lead, that is one of the areas that you're looking into in terms of the utility allowance calculation to ensure that properties get a utility allowance that's better matches the actual utility usage of that property. And a lot of properties have a lot of green features and the rest that many utility allowance calculations don't fully capture the benefits
Right.
of that. So thank you for that. Moving beyond developers, how about when you think of property managers, state agencies, tenants of the properties, maybe the other various stakeholders and thoughts you have for each of them?
Yeah, I think that right now with having more limits decreasing, it enters back into this area of confusion. So we've had very nice, steady increasing income limits. So we've forgotten how to apply hold harmless. When does it apply? How do new projects work? How does my gross rent floor work? I think it's going to be for state agencies, it's going to be a complicated time as they're thinking about their rent charts and their new projects that are coming online and how is this being applied. And so I think it's just for state agencies, remember, get back to our basics and refresh yourself on how income limits work in decreasing areas and be prepared to help your developers and to a certain extent tenants that are reaching out to you about how this impacts them. I think that for residents, I think this is good news. It's nice, steady increase. It's a 3.4% increase on average. And so even if somebody is able to take your rent right up to the max right away, that's a nice, steady increase. It's not the big increases that we've been seeing over the last few years where managers have really had to struggle about how do I implement this and when, and what is the impact this is going to have on residents. this is more of a steady increase, more manageable for everybody. But on the flip side, for prospective residents, it's a little more difficult because those big increases have helped people qualify. And so the steady increase means that if you're on the border, you might not be qualifying now like you thought you might if we got a big increase.
I really like your point about making sure that you're adopting these rules. If you have higher income limits, be adopting them right away for qualification of residents. So those tenants that are on the margin that maybe didn't qualify a month ago could qualify. You could call them back and say, good news. So you can rent the unit now, which helps obviously. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's important because I've had a few projects recently that have been struggling on lease up for whatever reason, and more vacancies than I've seen in the system. And maybe it's just certain geographic areas that I'm looking at, but I think this is great news for those. Like, take this moment and look back at your rejection pile and see who you rejected that was close. Take a look at your applicant pile and see who might be able to qualify now, and so that you can get these units leased up and back to generating revenue. And more importantly, back to helping local tenant, right?
More importantly is giving someone a place to live. So we talked about the income limits. I know you'll do more on the webinar, but I wanted to take a slight detour here. And developers are very focused on difficult to develop areas and qualified census tracts, and the fact that they get a bonus in terms of eligible basis, bonus and qualified basis, such that they can generate more tax credits, which is particularly useful for private activity bond financed 4% bond deals. For 9% credits, they could just give you the bonus. But for private activity bonds, that's not the case. Explain to the audience the relevance of these income limits for those calculations.
Yeah, so when we look at the calculation of a DDA and QCT, the income limits play an important part of that calculation for both those areas. For a difficult to develop area, the calculation is the fair market, basically the fair market rent divided by the tax credit rent. And so now that we have this 2026 income information, and then also for qualified census tracts, it plays a part into the calculation of calculating if it's a low income census tract. So now that we have this information from HUD, we can actually go and do our own calculation of QCTs and DDAs and estimate out in advance of HUD. So HUD will release the DDAs and QCTs in September, but hopefully our internal process here, we should have our calculation ready in, I think, a week, maybe 2 weeks, to be able to start providing that to the public. And it's interesting, when we were building this, we went back and obviously tested it over the last 3 prior years and more to see how accurate we were. And on QCTs, we have a very high accuracy. Almost every area is correct. On DDAs, it's a little more difficult because HUD has these additional adjustments. We love to talk about HUD adjustments, but still, even on those, we have a very high accuracy on our estimates. And so if this is something you're interested in, it's one more piece of information. If you have an area that's currently in and now our estimate's showing that you're out, it might help speed up your application process so you get that application submitted. We think it's going to be a great tool for developers as they're trying to manage their pipeline and understand new areas, to have one more piece that says, okay, this is what might happen. And so if it does, how does that impact your decisions here?
So thank you for that very good explanation. And it is an exciting service to be able to offer to clients going forward. So thank you for your leadership there. What else would you like to share with our audience before I let you go?
Yeah, so I think that we've hit on a lot of it. Obviously, we have the webinar coming up. We get very much into detail, and I always joke that this is a topic that really benefits from a slide deck behind you, because I throw numbers at you or I list off 10 different cities, and it's much easier if you can just see the map and see your city. Also, when we get into the adjustments, it's better if we have the visuals to help solidify it. So I think the webinar is great. We have a blog post out that you should look at that has some good information. And then looking forward, the Income Limits Working Group is still interacting with HUD, still working with them to set policy. So if you're interested in income limits, and we call it the Income Limits Working Group, it maybe should be the HUD Working Group, but then people might think we're doing HUD audits, but it's really any sort of HUD data or federal data that impacts us is really what we're looking at. And so we've done stuff with fair market rents. We've submitted comments on how they calculate DDAs, QCTs. Anything coming out of HUD, we're looking closely at. So if that's stuff that you're interested in, if you're a large organization, there probably should be somebody in your organization that's interested in this. So I'd encourage you to reach out about joining that, even if it's just to help support our endeavors to make sure that somebody's watching HUD to make sure that everything is accurate, and that if they're anticipating any changes, we're helping get the word out and helping educate HUD on that impact to us under low-income housing tax credits, because they're working with all these other programs. We really do a lot of good work in educating HUD about its impact to our stakeholders. And then finally, the income limit estimator, as many of you know and use, we estimate income limits for future years. We'll have that update out around September. So definitely look back for that. And that's when we really start to get some really good data about what's happening in the future years and very specific data about what's happening in your specific county. I think that's really what I'm thinking about with income limits right now. Anything I missed? Anything you think about it?
I appreciate your leadership in the income limit and the other areas that you mentioned, interacting with HUD. And it seems so obvious that the service that you're providing is needed. But when I think back over the 40 years, since this is the 40th anniversary of the low-income tax credit, it's only since you started getting really involved in income limits that I think the broader community paid more attention to what was actually underlying HUD calculations. And for something as significant as it is, it only affects every low-income tax credit property in the country. So it's such a significant issue. And I do think HUD does an amazing job with their efforts to get the limits out timely, to make adjustments as appropriate with the estimates and all the rest. And even this recent release with slightly more information being made available. So they do a wonderful job. When you're working through the working group and interacting with HUD and otherwise doing the analysis that you do, it's a huge service. So thank you for that. Let me go say to the audience, please hang around Thomas. I want you to be here for the off mic section. But to the audience, for more information on the topics that we discussed, please reach out to Thomas via the show notes link for this episode. His contact information will be there. And before we, though, go to the off mic section, I do want to encourage the audience to subscribe to Tax Credit Tuesday on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Also, if you're not driving, please take a moment right now to like and comment on the episode. If you're driving, please, once you get to where you're going, please take a moment to stop and comment on the episode. If you like it, comment on the episode, it helps raise our visibility and assists others in finding our podcast. I also encourage you to share episodes of Tax Credit Tuesday with your colleagues. And if you have any questions you'd like to hear on an upcoming episode, not only just hear the question, but hear us address an answer to the question, or if you have suggestions for topics you'd like to have us covered here on Tax Credit Tuesday, please email them to contact@novoco.com. That's contact@novoco.com. Okay, let's turn to the off mic section. So Thomas, as we like to use this space to give a shout out to others working in the tax credit and tax incentive communities, to highlight a professional who deserves recognition. So Thomas, who would you like to shout out?
Yeah, so you're kind of stealing my thunder a second ago. I was going to give a shout out to HUD, particularly Adam Bibler there, who is the one who's in charge of the calculations. He's been so open and free with information to us as we try and ask questions and understand their change in methodology and why they do that. It's been great working with HUD. It's nice to see the insight. I think that a lot of people think HUD just has a formula and they do the calculation, which largely they do. But every year they're looking and saying, is this correct? Are we getting the correct figures? Is this reflecting what's actually happening? That's one thing that led to the change from using a CPI growth rate to a per capita wages and salary, because they thought that better reflected what was happening with income limits. And they didn't just think that, they went back and did the research and looked back over the years. And so I think that it's been great having this working relationship with HUD that's been cultivated through the working group. So just a shout out to HUD for being a great partner with us as we're trying to build affordable housing.
I could not agree more. Echo your shout out to Adam and others at HUD that work on these income limits. It's very important to developing and operating affordable housing throughout the country, and their efforts to get as accurate an estimate as possible is incredibly challenging. And the fact that they're constantly looking at it and trying to make it better without changing things too much on a year-to-year basis. It's an interesting process to try to weigh and balance, and they do a wonderful job. So thank you, HUD. And to you, Thomas, thank you for being on the podcast today. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.